A schoolgirl drifted into the classroom unseen. A Deathworld impostor wrapped her flesh. The screen inside the tactical console pulsed with red warning lights as the locking pins on the secondary sector door snapped. Rilith did not turn around when the heavy magnetic seals broke. The corridor outside was cold, smelling of iron filters and old composite dust under the emergency lamps. A shadow moved fast through the crimson glare, its claws clicking on the floor paneling as it locked its heat organs onto the solitary shape in the hallway. Lena Vazik stepped into the path of the charge, her left forearm wrapped tightly in a torn uniform jacket. She did not slide backward into the safety of the reinforced classroom. She shifted her weight onto her heels, lifted a crude steel support rod she had torn from a laboratory bench, and waited for the impact. Would you have bolted behind the emergency seals, or would you have stayed to watch what a Deathworld generalist does when the lights turn red? Because she did not bolt. You'll want to hear how this ends. Trust me on that. 21 days earlier, the Academy terminal had registered no movement at all when the girl first crossed the threshold. Rilith sat on the third tier of Lecture Hall 9, listening to the heavy hydraulic thump of the neighboring Gerlock students' cardiovascular system. Every native species in the Zenith Spire carried specialized sensors to read the shifting pressure of their surroundings. Velsey scholars were born to measure air displacement, thermal gradients, and the faint chemical trails left by passing bodies. But when Lena Vazik walked through the open sliding panel, Rilith's cranial antennae flattened instantly against the bone. She did not push a single column of air forward. She drifted into the room unseen, a quiet shape wrapped in muted grey cloth, her footsteps leaving no vibration in the floor plates. Professor Cavalan stopped his lecture, his lower pair of limbs pressing tight against his thorax while he adjusted the molecular display slate. He did not look at the new arrival directly. He called her name, describing her as the first human student assigned to the integrated curriculum under the Mid-Spiral Treaty. The Gerlock boy, Dorvon, leaned across the aisle with his neck frills flared in an easy display of physical dominance, but Lena merely offered a brief smile that showed no enamel. She took an empty desk 3 rows ahead, setting down a woven fiber sack with a fluid coordination that seemed to absorb its own kinetic impact. That evening, Rilith accessed the central registry to analyze the official environmental profile of the human system. The display slate remained half empty, a stark wall of solid black classification bars hiding the true nature of her home world beneath administrative code lines. Atmospheric variables were sealed. Tectonic indices were blank. The only field left unredacted by the integration board sat under the metabolic category, listing her species as an adaptive omnivore. Rilith touched the metallic rim of the screen, tracking the system notes until a solitary footnoted paper from the assessment division appeared. The text described an early survival methodology that used no tools or fire. It called the strategy persistence predation, a multi-day pursuit loop where the hunter simply walked after a target until the prey's heart surrendered to exhaustion. The laboratory session during the second week forced the first physical breach through her social camouflage. The classroom smelled of liquid ammonia and the sharp mineral bite of active chemical reagents. Rilith was paired at the neighboring workstation, measuring synthetic catalysts into glass vessels, while Lena assisted Dorvon with the pressurized containment flasks. The work required delicate fine motor inputs to prevent cross-contamination. Lena picked up a Class 6 rated glass pipette, her blunt fingers positioning the tube over a smaller microvessel. Dorvon dropped a heavy mixing tool on the metal deck, and Lena's hand reacted before her skull turned toward the sound. Her skin tightened by a fractional millimeter. The glass tube did not fracture along its manufacturing seam. It shattered completely into fine shards under her grip. A jagged edge scored a diagonal line across her palm, and a dark substance welled from the split tissue before she could press a uniform cloth against the wound. The vapor hit the room's ventilation system within 5 heartbeats. Rilith's antennae curled tightly as the chemoreceptors decoded the airborne trail, registering a high density of free-floating iron. The metallic element was the same material used to reinforce destroyer hulls and forge orbital defense bulkheads. yet it was circulating freely through her veins to carry oxygen. The biological reaction across the laboratory was immediate and uncontrolled. A sensitive Palori scholar in the front tier went completely rigid, her sensory tendrils coiling into her skull as her automated predator proximity alarm triggered a total nervous shutdown. 2 seats away, a lightweight Velith student collapsed off his stool, his digestive tract initiating a violent rejection reflex caused by the sudden chemical signature of an active apex force. Professor Cavalan shouted for emergency medical support, his forearms spreading wide to keep the remaining students from stampeding toward the secondary exits. Lena did not move from her station. She held her wrapped hand flush against her torso, her face pale but her breathing steady as she maintained a non-threatening posture until the containment team arrived. The medical technicians swept her skin with a diagnostic reader, their faces freezing when the screen displayed the initial cell mobilization rates. The wound was already closing its own margins, building a localized seal out of protein fibers and cellular debris without the use of tissue nanites. The diagnostic console indicated an active pain response, but her primary neural clusters chose to ignore the damage report to remain fully operational. The senior technician ordered a complete biological classification review before releasing her back to the residential sector. The administrative board initiated the mandatory physical fitness circuit 7 days later, recalibrating the evaluation gear in the sub-level hub to standard Class 8 tolerances. The training room was crowded with heavy gravity specialists who viewed the human student's lean frame as a mathematical assurance of failure. Dorvon stood near the primary testing platform, his massive torso glistening under the halogen arrays as he posted a high kinetic output score. He laughed toward the monitoring staff, suggesting that the curve should be adjusted to spare the newcomer's pride. Lena stepped onto the platform, her small hands closing around the sensor grip with an awkward familiarity that suggested she had never tested her body against mechanical limits. She squeezed the pad, and the ledger numbers bypassed the Class 4 threshold where the insectoid species topped out. The reading passed the Class 6 marker, entering the weight category of the native dominant cultures. When the screen flashed a Class 7 rating, the room went entirely quiet. She had registered a grip classification just one level below a Gerlock's capacity, using an organic mass that was 6 times smaller than her competitor's build. The endurance trial ran immediately afterward on a circular traction track that increased its resistance every 90 seconds. The Skith ambush predator students dominated the initial sprints, their neural pathways firing with explosive initial velocity before burning through their chemical reserves by the 12th lap. By trial 20, their systems were spent, forcing them to drop from the track with severe metabolic fatigue. Lena maintained a moderate, unhurried pace that did not vary by a single millisecond. Her skin color shifted to a deep rose tone, and a saline fluid began to form across her brow, using surface evaporation to regulate her internal furnace. The ambient temperature sensors around her platform registered a drop of 2 degrees as her body dumped its excess heat into the immediate environment. She outlasted the midfield, then the endurance specialists, until she was the only shape remaining on the track. She did not stop because her muscles failed. She stepped off the mechanism because the proctors cut the power to clear the floor for the environmental test pods. When the final tallies posted on the wall display, she did not hold the highest rank in any single category, but she sat within the top tier of every physical parameter simultaneously. She had no specialized weapon, which meant she had no predictable limitation. The warning klaxon sounded 2 days later during a third-period review session, its low-frequency drone traveling through the primary support pillars of the building. The central artificial intelligence spoke through the overhead grills, its voice stripped of personal inflection as it reported an uncontained biological hazard in the Eastern Research Corridor. An adult Korvathi marauder had breached its magnetic habitat wall. The corporate security force estimated an 11-minute delay before an armed response team could reach the sector. The students moved toward the lecture hall corners, pulling down the sliding security shutters to lock themselves behind the standard composite plates. Rilith monitored the corridor feed through a personal terminal, watching the red light wash over the empty hallway outside. The Predator was a 40-kilogram ambush specialist, its quad-segmented frame designed to slip through air ducts and structural gaps by tracking the heat signatures of warm-blooded prey. A single sting from its hollow tail spines carried a neurotoxin that would paralyze a Gerlock or stop a Valesey scholar's lungs within minutes. Lena stood up from her bench, her movements showing the same fluid coordination that had marked her arrival. She did not join the cluster of students huddling behind Dorvon's massive frame. She tore a steel support rod from the edge of an empty workstation, bending the composite frame back until the metal unseated with a sharp screech of tearing rivets. She wrapped her uniform jacket around her left sleeve, creating a thick multi-layered pad from her wrist to her elbow. "The panel is locked," Professor Cavalan whispered, his digits frozen over the main desk controls. "You cannot clear that boundary manually." Lena did not answer with words. She pried the plastic casing off the wall override module with her bare fingernails, found the mechanical emergency lever inside, and threw her weight against the iron bar. The door slid back, and she stepped out into the red light of the corridor alone, letting the seal snap closed behind her. Rilith watched the tactical screen as the camera feed tracked her progress down the central axis. The Corvathi Marauder was waiting at the junction, its chameleon plates shifting from the grey wall color to a deep crimson as it registered her thermal signature. The beast exploded forward, covering 10 meters of deck plate in less than a second with its tail spines fanned open. Lena shifted her stance, pivoted her hips along a tight trajectory, and sidestepped the direct path of the lunge. The creature passed through the empty space she had occupied a heartbeat before, its claws scraping the synthetic flooring as it tried to reverse its momentum. Lena brought the steel rod down in a tight arc, striking the exact neurological seam where the skull plate joined the first spinal segment. No hesitation, no wild swing, no second guess. The Predator's coordination shattered instantly, its limbs sprawling across the floor panels while its tail thrashed in a blind defensive sweep that caught the padded fabric of her left sleeve. The keratin needles pierced the outer layers of the jacket, but stopped before reaching the skin. Lena grabbed the base of the appendage with her bare right hand, locking the muscle immobile against the deck, while she delivered two final strikes with the iron rod until the thrashed shape went completely limp. She left the stunned animal on the panels and moved toward the far end of the corridor, where a wounded laboratory assistant lay slumped against the research wing door. The native staff member was losing fluid from a deep thoracic cut, his skin color fading to a dead gray. Lena knelt in the pooled fluid, pressing her bare palms against the open breach to apply steady physical compression. She stayed on her knees for 9 minutes, her head tilted to monitor his erratic breathing until the armored security squad cleared the far intersection. The integration registry updated its public files before the evening shift began, clearing the black bars from her profile page. The coordinate entry for Earth was reclassified as an unrated Class 12 Deathworld, a category the department had never applied to a civilized system. The social spacing in the corridors widened by 2 full meters the next morning, the other scholars filtering past her desk with a silent, calculated avoidance that left an empty circle around her position. Rilith carried the heavy, metallic-rimmed Xenobiology Codex across the refectory floor that evening, the sound of light Valesey footsteps tapping against the wide composite tiles. Lena sat at the central table with an untouched tray of fruit, her hands showing a fine tremor as her system finished processing the residual adrenaline from the previous day's encounter. Rilith did not turn back toward the crowded insectoid tables. The heavy slate display slid onto the synthetic table between them, its blue light reflecting off the clean, unredacted lines of the text. "The final test covers the multi-cardiac networks," Rilith said, adjusting the data pins on the edge of the rim. "Your notes from the last session left 3 structural variables incomplete, and I do not intend to lower my average by association." Lena looked at the open screen, her predator eyes widening slightly before her lips parted into a wide, uncovered smile that showed the small pointed canines her ancestors had used to claim their place on the plane. She reached out, her fingers touching the edge of the light screen while the evening filters dimmed the upper glass of the spire.